why even deal with critical thinking when you're dealing with pre-design analysis, architectural programming? Well, it's because it's very basic to being able to do it well and do it properly and do it appropriately. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to deal with a lot of information. You're trying to do something with it that makes it useful and appropriate for the task at hand. And so you want to come up with valid conclusions. You want to come up with appropriate selections of information. You want to come up with a method for putting the information in a format that can be used in the manner or for the purpose that it was intended to be used. So all of this is a set of skills that not everybody is particularly good at it, but most of you practice it every day, and you may not be conscious of it. So what is this thing called critical thinking? It's always brought up, particularly in the context of education. In fact, the Architectural Accreditation Board lists a whole category called critical thinking as their number one first category in the student performance criteria. And then there's a number of subcategories under critical thinking. But these are the basic components. When you're involved in critical thinking, you're judging something. You're looking at something and you're creating some sort of a judgment about it. You're making distinctions between things. You've got several things and you're beginning to create some categories, some distinctions between them. You're placing them within some sort of a set of preconceptions that you have or constructs that you have about those things. So when you say you might have a number of trees that you're looking at, you begin to organize them according to deciduous trees or evergreen trees or conifers or whatever. So you're making distinctions between them. You're also analyzing and evaluating. The whole process of evaluation is another whole complex process. So you've got something in front of you, you're looking at it, you're analyzing it, and then you're evaluating it. You're placing some judgment on it. You're looking at it from many different evaluative perspectives, whether it's performance or something else. And then after all of that activity, you have to be able to pull back and draw some conclusions, look at, again, the big picture, and understand where something fits. So these are all kinds of things that are involved in critical thinking. And programming in particular can get to be very complex. Particularly, you'll see that as the information starts to flood in, it's coming from many different directions, and there's many different categories of information and many different levels of information. In some cases, the information is detailed, in some cases, it's general. So programming involves that, and so therefore, it's important that you have those critical thinking skills in order to know what to do with that information as it floods in. It's a lot more difficult now because you have the internet and you have many, many sources of information. There's no problem with getting lots of information. The problem is you're getting too much information. And it's what is now called sort of drinking. It's like drinking from the fire hydrant. You have to know what to do with it as it floods in. It's has been called chatter, because you could be getting it from so many different sources. It's also changing very rapidly. Things change overnight. And because of that, the whole thing is challenging and requires that you know how to deal with it. And that's really what you need to be very conscious of. And part of that is knowing what's relevant and what isn't relevant. So you can begin to sort and shift and figure out what kind of, in a sense, what box to put it in. But you know, in the whole process of doing that, what you don't want to lose sight of is that there's a lot of creativity involved, and you're bringing something to it as well. So you don't want to end up turning it into like a hard science, where you're collecting data and you're kind of using some sort of cold, hard process, very logical, very rational process that excludes your creativity, it excludes your intuition, it excludes what you're bringing to the table. So that's another balancing act. How do you balance those things? You balance what you might call factual information, which often isn't really factual, with your sort of gut reaction, your sort of phenomenological reaction to something. So that's what makes it particularly interesting and challenging and I think fascinating. So what's the attitude you should bring to critical thinking? One of the first things that you need to do is not be lazy about it. You get your first impression, you quit. Well, you really don't have anything yet. What you have to do is really challenge things and ask questions in your own head. Like, does this really make sense? Is this information biased? So you're not just a sponge, kind of bringing it all in and just sort of saying, okay, I've got it all, which can happen with downloading a lot of stuff on the internet. You see something that's got a few keywords, I got to download that, stick it in there. So you ask questions about things that even seem to have no obvious need to question. Because sometimes things that you kind of accepted for years as obvious and true, sometimes overnight they're not true anymore. And that's because somebody questioned it and realized, hey, this was an article of faith. It wasn't factual. It was a belief. And that came out because somebody questioned it. So you don't take anything for granted. You're kind of the ultimate skeptic. And it's not a bad thing to be skeptic. It can be annoying to somebody who you're spending a lot of time with. But you can do it in a way that doesn't turn you into this negative person who's always sort of finding the fault with things and voicing that, but it's someone whose mind is very actively judging and evaluating and critiquing and asking questions and so on. And it's not everyone's personality. Some people are born that way, some people have to work really hard at it. Because they would prefer to walk around in the world just worrying about where their next meal is going to come from or where they left their car. So it's it's kind of a habit for some people, it's perpetual for some people, for other people it takes work. So these are critical thinkers. You can see on the left, these are some famous critical thinkers: Charles Darwin, Sigmund Freud, Pascal, Albert Einstein. And each one of them were scientific or philosophical trailblazers because they were critical thinkers and they didn't accept the status quo thinking automatically, but they challenged it. So critical thinkers are curious people. They're actively curious about the world around them. They're honest with themselves about their own limitations in terms of knowledge. What knowledge do they really have, or what knowledge, instead of assuming that they're experts in everything, which a lot of architects like to do. I'm often accused of that by my wife. They resist being manipulated, particularly by the media. You know, you watch ads on television, and 99% of them are trying to manipulate you into believing something that may not even be really true. And the same is very true of politicians. You know, they're trying to sell you something with manipulation. And if you're a critical thinker, you see past that. You say, wait a minute, what about this, this, and this? That just, that contradicts what they're saying. And they're giving us a slanted, sort of twisted, biased kind of information, trying to manipulate you. So you ask questions. You don't accept things at face value. You try to overcome confusion and deception, particularly self-deception and your own prejudices. And that's really hard to do because most people aren't even aware of what their prejudices are. The ones you're aware of are easy. Maybe you don't like cats. So you're aware of that, you can overcome that, and you can be more accepting of something like that. Whenever you can, you base things on evidence. You look for the hard, cold evidence. But not always. Sometimes it has to be a combination of actual evidence and logical reasoning from evidence that's not directly related but indirectly related. Or maybe it's something that you learned years ago that has proven itself over the years, but there's no real evidence right now that you can count on. The other thing that you do if you're a critical thinker is you're always looking for connections between things. So you're drawing connections, you're seeing patterns. And the people who really see patterns are like the people in the movie The Beautiful Mind movie, where they're seeing patterns where no one else has seen them, and they are able to make something useful and important out of those patterns, which kind of led to things like chaos theory and complexity science, and some of the more recent ways of thinking about the world around us. The other thing you need to do is go from being 1 minute thinking about the cosmos and astrophysics and particle physics and sort of large universal questions down to that are broad and big questions, down to very detailed and very specific things. If you're a programmer, very often you have to be you have to be able to jump at 1 minute from big questions and big issues down to doorknobs. Because that's what the client, the person you're talking to, the user you're interviewing, they may be really interested in doorknobs, but you really need to know something about the whole place. And so you have to be able to jump back and forth. You also have to know what kind of questions to ask, and what information you should be seeking. Because you don't want to be spending all your energy on the wrong stuff. And in the end, it turns out that it wasn't useful, it wasn't relevant. And you could have been spending your energy on the right questions and getting much better stuff. And so that's part of the skill that you have to have, the judgment you have to be a good critical thinker. But you also have to listen to your inner voice, because that's not just some magical arbitrary thing. It's something that you have evolved and developed over your lifetime based on your experiences and your beliefs and things that have happened to you that have proven themselves. Even though you can't totally articulate it, there's a sense you have about something. And that's a legitimate thing. You can't maybe explain it to somebody else, you can't write it out like a mathematical formula or anything like that, but it's there. You also have to be someone who doesn't follow the crowd, sort of unquestioning what everybody else is doing, and you just do it because everybody else is doing it. You stand back and say, okay, I may want to do that, but let me think about it for a minute. Is it something really that I want to do or I should be doing? And that's particularly true of intellectual thought. So if there's a current opinion about something that people are buying into, you don't necessarily immediately jump on board, but you ask yourself, well, now, do I believe this also? even though my friends on my group, my social group all believes it. So you don't go along with things. You might, in the end, say, yeah, okay, I do believe it. I thought about it and I do believe it. So you're not following fashions blindly. You're following fashions because you like the fashion and you've made a conscious choice to follow it. And you have to have the courage to not follow it, even though your peer group is following it, because your critical thinking skills have brought you to the point where you realize, no, this isn't for me. So going down the list, first impressions are important. First impressions have a lot more, in some cases, a lot more sort of the content of your understanding of something that is intuitive and based upon things that you can't even explain, because you kind of have this holistic experience, a phenomenological holistic experience of first impression. That's good, it's important, but you shouldn't rely on that completely. You back it up with a more rounded understanding of something, going way beyond first impressions, by really digging in a little bit and going to second and third impressions. And along with that, of course, comes that you don't take anything for granted. And this is where you can infuriate people, because they may say something that's so obvious and seems so factual that no one could possibly question it, and you question it. And they are wondering, what's wrong with you? Why are you even questioning this? It's obvious that it's true. You learn from experience. You trust experience. Because that's really the main thing you have, is experience. That's something you personally have gone through, so you know what it is. Now, you can be misled by your experience. Maybe because you were in a bad mood that day, you have something, an experience that you thought very negatively of, but it really wasn't that bad. So, kind of in all of this, put all this together, and what it requires is someone with courage, someone with a good sense of self, someone who trusts themselves in terms of their thinking skills and their intellectual power. So you need to look at yourself, self-examine yourself in a critical way, and say, am I this person? Can I be more like this person? Or is it hopeless? I'll never be like this person. I may as well pack it in and not be involved in programming. These are some of the mistakes that you can make, and often are made. And the little mistake here is confusing time and space. It says the outfielder goes back, way back, to the Mesozoic era, where he was immediately devoured by 4 large flesh-eating reptiles. He went back in space, but the confusion is that he went back in time. That's flawed thinking. Deception. You can have an agenda, and you can say, okay, I better slant this evidence. I better make this argument one-sided because I really want an outcome, a certain outcome. So there's deception involved. Now you may do that, or someone may be doing it to you. So you need to be conscious of that. If you're being uncritical and evidence is provided that turns out to be false, and you just kind of accept it, that's a mistake that you can make in that whole process of critical thinking. Something very, very common in architecture students and architects is to bring pet ideas to the table. You've always wanted to do an apartment building that was a big sphere. That was your pet idea. This big sphere, that would be so cool. But that's a pet idea that really may be a nonsensical idea, but you want to do it, so you push all of the evidence in that direction, and you do everything you can to sell that idea, despite all of the logic and evidence and everything else that argues against it. And so that kind of a pet idea is an extreme example, but there are many other kinds of pet ideas that are much more subtle. You want a certain outcome. So you set up a self-fulfilling prophecy kind of situation with the evidence that you presented and everything else. Another mistake you can make is just using the wrong methodology, the wrong approach. You should be doing interviews, but you're not. You're sending out questionnaires. And that's not the right methodology, so you're not getting the kind of information that you need. You could stop too quickly. You get tired of doing it, you run out of time. You didn't get the big important piece of information because you stopped prematurely getting the information that you needed. Now you're going to be facing that because you're working in a very short time frame on a very complex situation. And even though you're just doing representative portions, you could very easily cut it off before that critical piece has fallen into place or has arrived. The other problem you can make is never reaching any conclusion. You just keep thinking and thinking and thinking and getting more and more stuff, and you never create any kind of closure or conclusion. It just keeps rolling. You can also misinterpret things, obviously. You can easily do that. You're getting some data, and you're drawing the wrong conclusions from the data. For whatever reason. Sometimes because you're looking for a certain conclusion, so as soon as you see something that looks like the conclusion you're looking for, that is the conclusion that you go with. The other thing you can do is set the wrong priorities. You don't set up a hierarchy with the right questions. You take something pretty irrelevant and you put too much emphasis on it, too much importance on it. Something that's highly important, you basically ignore. So that can be an important mistake. Now in all of this, we have to think about what's the difference between information and data and knowledge and wisdom. Information, this is how information is defined in the dictionary, the American Heritage Dictionary. Information is knowledge derived from study, experience, or instruction. I think that's a bit confusing because now they're saying information is knowledge. And there's some subtle distinction. Information is knowledge of a specific event or situation. It's a collection of facts or data. I think it's more than, I don't agree with this. It's more than a collection. It's a collection that you have processed into information. The communication of knowledge, that one I can buy. Information is the communication of knowledge. And it's based on data. So, my conclusion here is that information leads to knowledge, which leads to wisdom. You know something because you have information, and the more you know things, the more wise you become. Data, on the other hand, is simply stuff. It's stuff that you haven't, has no information until you make it into information. It has to be processed. So, if you get a whole series of numbers, you have to look for the patterns in the numbers. So you have to do something with it for it to become information rather than just stuff. Here's all the different kinds of information that you might be engaging as you're doing programming. There's obviously factual information, and it's mostly descriptive. what's something like. Then there's explanatory information where it explains why something is the way it is. So you can describe something and then talk about, well, why is it like that? It's another category of information. There's deontic information, which explains how it should be, what ought this thing to be like. And then there's instrumental information on how to do something. So these are the main categories of information. And you may be involved a lot more in the factual information category, and maybe on what things ought to be like. These are different techniques for getting that information that you need. You obviously can do literature search, internet search, just collecting a lot of information from existing sources, authoritative sources. And I guess in some cases it could even be Wikipedia if it's an appropriate Wikipedia entry. Some aren't. There's also observation. You can sit somewhere and watch what's going on and take notes, observe behavior, observe how people are using the building, observe a number of things. And sometimes that observation is something you've already done over a period of time, because each one of you is a user, which is kind of a unique situation. You're a programmer and a user. So you have observed your fellow classmates in studio, you've observed yourself there, so you can already draw quite a few conclusions, and you already have a great deal of information based on observation. There are some formal kinds of observations. There's something called the walkthrough, where you have an agenda that you're looking for. You might walk through the place, and you're looking for very particular things in your observations. There's sort of the hidden observer, the old behind the one-way mirror kind of observer. You can observe really by taking a lot of photographs and then later on really studying the photographs. So you quickly take a lot of digital shots and then later on you really study what is in the picture that you didn't have time to do. And I think there's even observation through sketching, where you can sit down somewhere and in the act of sketching something, you're seeing at a whole other level of intimacy and detail. You're engaging it in a whole different way than just taking a picture of it. And you can take sound recordings and so different kinds of things you can do to collect that information through observation. You can conduct surveys, which means that you put together a formal survey instrument of some sort. Sometimes the surveys are just simply telephone surveys. Sometimes they're mailings. You've all been approached to participate in surveys, and it happens more and more. Every time you are provided a service, now they call you back and say, would you mind filling out a survey on how we did? This becomes such a routine thing. Sometimes surveys can be longitudinal. That means that you're looking at something over a long period of time. A cross-sectional survey is something that in one moment of time you look across a large cross-section of people or events or things. The other thing, of course, is you can actually conduct interviews, and I think some of you are planning or have already gone through some sort of interview thing, either a simulated interviews or actual interviews. And interviewing is tricky. It's even more tricky than doing questionnaires, because little things like your body language, the way your facial expressions, the kinds of questions you ask, all of that are clues and are part of the engagement with the person that you're interviewing. And can make a difference to the outcome. So professional interviewing, proper professional interviewing is a very highly developed learned skill. And but then there are informal interviews. There are all kinds of different interviews. I always used a back of my pocket interview. What I would have was, I would sit down with somebody I'm interviewing, doing programming, and I would have nothing in front of me. I would have no set of questions. I would have only something. Occasionally I would make a little bit of a note, a keyword note. I wouldn't write out what they're saying. I would just put a little thing to jog my memory later. And in my back pocket, I would have the list of important topic areas I wanted to cover. So we would have this conversation for however long, and then at the end I would say, excuse me for a minute, I just want to check to make sure I've covered everything. And I pull up my list, I look through it quickly, and I say, oh yeah, we need to talk about this as well. That means that during that whole time, I can be fully engaged in that person. I'm not constantly looking at my list and looking back up and say, oh yeah, now question number 10 is such and such. And that's a whole different conversation. That puts it in a different relationship with the person that you're interviewing. And I didn't discover that right at first. And I began to realize that the people I was talking to were getting kind of fed up with it. They wanted to get going. They thought there were too many questions. It was too kind of cut and dried, and it wasn't personal, and it wasn't engaging. So that's why I went to that technique. And that seemed to work a lot better. So that was sort of an informal but structured, is the way I thought of it. When you're doing questionnaires, you really have to know what you're doing. You have to do it in such a way, and I've done questionnaires where I've gone through and I've developed a questionnaire I thought was a really good questionnaire, and I would go through the necessary pre-testing of the questionnaire. I would, give it to a sample of people who were going to be filling it out. I would have them fill it out, and then I would interview them later and say, okay, what did you think of this question? Did it suggest what I wanted you to answer, or what was it about the questionnaire that you didn't particularly think worked very well? And so I would have to very often redesign the questionnaire quite extensively and say that question number 9 didn't work. They didn't understand the question. Or question number 10 was too leading and had a bias built into it, and so on. And these were things I didn't realize at the time I made up the questionnaire. I thought it was a great questionnaire, but it turned out it wasn't. There were problems with it. And so I would have to, and then I would issue the questionnaire. So that's something that you have to keep in mind. You can also gather information through simulation games, having people role play, having all kinds of different things that go beyond, that are a little different than just simply sitting down with someone, but there's an engagement in some activity. You can also gather a lot of information by modeling. And that was very much a fascination in the second half of the 20th century, where everybody was trying to figure out how to mathematically model everything. And now we can do a lot more modeling because we've got the technology to do that. And it's more and more important. Once you have that information, you need to know what to do with it. And that's where the analysis of the information comes in. And these are all the different kinds of things you can do with information to begin to analyze it and make something out of it. From identification, classification, counting, describing, ordering, extracting the essence out of the information, that's important. Figuring out what's the hidden information behind the information, what's not obvious that it's there, and of course validating the information is important and evaluating its usefulness. So these are questions that you ask yourself while you're doing that. What is it that I found? What is missing from what I have? What distinctions can be made among the things found? How can I categorize them? How groupings seem to fall into? Is there a range of importance here? Are some things of greater magnitude and size and other things small and less significant? Is there some frequency of occurrence of certain kinds of things so you can begin to draw some conclusions about validation and patterns and so on? When you're describing the information, what you're doing is you're isolating certain features or certain attributes that help you to categorize. We're all about creating little boxes of kind of reductionist thinking, where that helps us to function in the world. If we didn't do that, and everything was just holistic and all-encompassing and all at once, then we couldn't cope with it. We would be kind of just lost in this soup of stuff hitting us. So in order to survive, we have to begin to sort and categorize and simplify. We eliminate certain bits of the information because we can't take it all in, and we have to make selections about the information. So we structure it. We also try to quantify. That's our nature. We try to quantify things. And we sometimes will try to describe the qualities of things. Quantifying is easier. Usually you're counting or measuring. There's a number of other things that you can do with analyzing information. You extract the essence, you edit out the unimportant parts, you clarify what is actually meant by it. You highlight the important stuff. You have your highlighter and you highlight that stuff. You translate something that may be in an unfamiliar way, stated in an unfamiliar way, so that you translate it into the way it's meaningful to you. You interpret things that may be there, but it needs interpretation to really get at what it is. You expand on it. You extrapolate things from it. You compare it to other things that you know about. So you're analyzing information. When you're analyzing information, what you're really trying to do is get more out of the information. Acquire knowledge from the information and eventually wisdom. So part of that is to bring outside other information that you may have had previously to the table. And so if the information you have just acquired becomes more valuable and more powerful, more useful. You can compare things, and when you start comparing things, maybe new patterns, new relationships start to emerge, new information about the information comes out because of that comparison. You can infer things from it. If this is the information, then probably this is also true, or some knowledge that we have. You always need to analyze information for validity. And there's different ways that you can do this. Sometimes you don't have the capability of testing its validity. But usually what you try and look for is authority. What authority is this information based on? Is the person who supplied the information, are they knowledgeable and qualified to give that information? Or the source of the information, is it valid? Because there's a lot of bad information out there. And to be able to sort through the valid information and the invalid information is kind of an important skill. Sometimes the information you get, you want to double check it to make sure it's correct by getting other sources of information that are about the same thing. See if everybody agrees. See if there's agreement. And you look for consistencies. Within, let's say it's an argument someone's making, you look at consistency, make sure they're not contradicting themselves, or that the information isn't contradictory, or that it lines up with what has been really very established facts. and that it's following a logic. There's a lot of faulty logic out there. I took a whole course in logic at University of Toronto, and I was surprised at all of the different ways that arguments can be posed that are illogical and drawing false conclusions. So, evaluating information is also part of this situation. And what you can see here, these are Kim White diagrams that are all looking at evaluating where does it fit, how do I pay for it, how do I plan it out, whether I should do it or not. So that's looking at evaluating it for usefulness. So I thought I would run through this with you just so you can kind of examine your own work and the team that you're in, their work, and kind of ask yourself questions about, are we following good critical thinking habits and practices? So that when you present your project in the end, you feel comfortable that you've drawn some valid conclusions, you've been working with good information, and that you've thought it through in a critical way, which means that you aren't just accepting things at face value, and you're really putting active thinking into it, and not just going along with whatever drops in your lap. So, pre-design, people who are good at pre-design analysis and programming, just by their very nature, kind of are this kind of person. And it isn't necessarily the kind of person who makes a good designer, because you could say that the designer would get all tied up in knots with all this thinking, all this critical evaluation, all this, and the thing that the designer really needs is to kind of have that intuitive, creative burst that can then be followed up, perhaps, with a team of people who are really solid critical thinkers. So that's one of the arguments why in Canada, for example, they made a real point of saying that the programmer is a different cat than the designer. That one is sort of, one side of the brain and the other is the other side of the brain. That whole theory doesn't hold water. But everyone can get better at it. And it's maybe something that we should really emphasize in first year, in the introductory class we have for becoming freshmen. And it's certainly something that graduate students, when you're writing your thesis, and every paper that you write, you need to be very conscious of and consciously practice. So, are there any questions, any comments? Anybody want to add anything to it? Anybody have any critical commentary? I always leave like 5 minutes at the end for this part, because this never really happens. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, I know some people, they become educated beyond their ability to think. If you know what I mean.
Yeah, I know what you mean, yeah. There are some people, I had a student once, I won't mention his name, but he believed in magic. And he got a lecture like this from another professor, not me, but this basically the same lecture. He got so irate and angry that he jumped up and said, "You're destroying the magic." And he stormed out of the room and dropped out of architecture.
Would you mind telling us if he was in this school or was it
here? Oh, wow. In fact, we were in that room. I was in the room next door. Yeah, he was quite a character. We stayed in touch. He actually became quite successful. He was really a contradiction, actually, because he was a real wheeler and dealer, and he opened up a business here in Tallahassee, where what he did was, in the Yellow Pages, back then, everybody paid attention to the Yellow Pages, the book. He had every trade, he had a full page ad for his services. Every, like, plumbing, electrical, all of them. And it turned out he had set up a consortium of all these trades around town, these small independent trade companies and so on, and had signed them up, and he was going to be their agent. And he marketed that like crazy, and he had a fleet of trucks, and he had his name on them and everything, and the whole thing fell apart. It was like a scam kind of deal. And the police were after him, and he had to move to New York.
I was gonna ask.
You destroyed the magic.
I was just gonna ask.
It's magic.
I kept in touch with him. For some reason, he thought I was kind of a kindred spirit. All right, well, I guess that's enough nonsense. Did somebody get the light?